Live from London, this is BBC News. Marine Le Pen's far-right party comes out on top in the first round of a snap French election.
Trading has begun between parties to rally around candidates to try to block the far right from power.
We'll be taking you live to the US, where the Supreme Court is set to decide whether the former President Donald Trump has immunity from prosecution over alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Well, here, with the general election just days away, the parties have begun a final push for votes, warning about what will happen if they don't win. A depraved and arrogant head teacher who sexually abused 4 girls is jailed today for 17 years. And this year's Wimbledon gets underway. Andy Murray says he will decide later today whether to play as he continues to recover from injury. Hello and welcome to BBC News. France's National Rally Party is celebrating victory in the first round of the country's snap election. President Macron's decision to send the country to the polls to shore up his own support appears to have backfired badly. He's now calling on centrist and left-wing parties to unite ahead of the final round of voting this weekend. Well, let's go straight to Paris and straight to our correspondent Mark Lowen, who's following the shocking results in terms of what we've seen emerged over the last 24 hours. And Mark, what happens now?
That is the $64 million question, I suppose, Matthew. It is a time of intense horse trading now in the aftermath of that first round of the parliamentary election that has absolutely stunned this country. I mean, the opinion polls were pointing towards this victory by the far-right National Rally, but never before has the National Rally been so close to forming a government here. It would be the first one since the Second World War, the first time since the Second World War that the far-right would be in power. And during the Second World War, it was during Nazi-occupied Vichy regime. So it's not even comparable. So France is stunned by this. It is a bombshell, and that bomb is still exploding as France tries to take in and digest what has happened in the last 24 hours, because the National Rally came out on top last night with 33% of the votes, ahead of a left-wing alliance called the New Popular Front at 28%, and President Macron's centrist Ensemble, or Together coalition, at 20%. So the question now is whether the opposition parties can unite around candidates to try to form a united front, really, to try to block the far right from power in the second round of the parliamentary election that will take place on Sunday. But there is such a lack of unity in the opposition that there are big doubts over whether that is possible, and big questions over whether the far right can actually get an absolute majority and get into power here. Our Paris correspondent Andrew Harding has all the drama of last night.
Overnight protests in Paris. These people are angry and worried about the success of the National Rally, a hard-right party that has now entered the mainstream of French politics, winning over a third of the vote in Sunday's election, a dominant performance. This morning, a subdued sense of shock in the French capital. The newspapers talking of the end of an era and the National Rally being at the gates of power. The National Rally's leader, Marine Le Pen, is hoping her party can now form France's next government. That would mark a seismic shift in France.
Mes chers compatriotes, la démocratie a parlé. Et les Français ont placé le Rassemblement
The
national.
RN, as it's known here, is an anti-immigrant, Eurosceptic party with a history of ties to the Kremlin. Le Pen's 28-year-old protégé, Jordan Bardella, is aiming to be France's next prime minister. After yesterday's vote, President Emmanuel Macron has called for centrist and left-wing parties to form a united front to keep the RN out of power. Will it work? It's going to be a struggle. Many French are worried about their country's deep political polarisation. The road ahead will become clearer in a week's time, when a second round of voting will determine France's future. There could be months of political deadlock, just as the country is preparing to host the Olympic Games. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Paris.
Yes, indeed. I mean, France should be basking in the excitement of the Olympics, but instead it has been plunged into political turmoil. Let's just unpick it all with Célia Bulletin, who joins us live. She is the senior fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations and head of the Paris office. Célia Bulletin, thanks very much indeed for being with us. The options now likely either an absolute majority for the far-right National Rally Party after Sunday's second round, or a hung parliament and paralysis. How do you assess the risks now facing France?
I think in both cases, what we can clearly envisage is a big win for the far right in France. Whether or not they make it to absolute majority will depend on the forces of opposition being able to coalesce and the strong dynamism that has pushed forward the national rally, whether or not this will continue one more week. In any case, this big, far-right push is likely to transform French politics for the future, at least for the remainder of Emmanuel Macron's presidency. This has been, it's a bombshell, as your correspondent said. This, French politics will not be the same after this election.
And where does this leave France on the world stage, Célia? Because, of course, with Macron now potentially a lame duck to some extent, if he has to have a cohabitation, potentially with a far-right government, big questions facing France over Ukraine and over, what could happen in the US in November. How do you assess the international risks that this election poses?
Well, clearly, the French president will be weakened by this gamble that he lost, and he will also be isolated within the French system. As we know, the Constitution offers quite a few prerogatives to the president, but they are at least as many for the prime minister, and they control the levers of government, the budgetary levers, the legislative levers. So actually, President Macron runs the risk of being an forevermore isolated, talking heads that does speeches but not necessarily being able to deliver. And this matters. It matters for Ukraine because France, under the leadership of President Macron, has been at the forefront of the pro-Ukraine coalition in Europe. Most recently in February, President Macron mentioned that the West might have to send troops on the ground, possibly to help Ukraine. All of this will be transformed under National Rally leadership, for which we know they've been highly critical of sanctions against Russia, completely against sending troops on the ground. And so it will make a big difference in Europe's leadership and potentially in Europe's capacity to stand up also to a new Donald Trump as president, if that so happens.
Yeah, a story with huge global implications. Célia Bulletin from the European Council on Foreign Relations, thanks very much indeed. Much more to come from us throughout the day, but for now, back to you in London.
Mark, thanks very much. Mark Lowen there in Paris. A quick reminder, if you're just joining us, we're waiting to hear from the US Supreme Court that really important decision about whether Donald Trump has immunity. That is the serene picture of the Supreme Court, but all eyes on the court about whether they will say that the former president had immunity from events surrounding the 2020 election and attempts to overturn it. Are they going to say he had immunity, not had immunity, partial immunity? Well, we wait to see. We're expecting that in the coming minutes, and we'll be talking to a variety of guests to take us through that crucial decision. Before that, let's turn to the election campaign here, because there are just 3 days of campaigning left before Thursday's election. By the end of the week, the shape of the new government will be clear, and as voting approaches, the parties are trying to gather as much support as possible. We'll round up the election campaign trail in a moment, but let's head to Scotland, because the SNP leader, John Swinney, waiting to talk to our correspondent there. And so let's head there and join Louise Cowie. Louise, over to you.
Hi there, yes, I am in Dundee, which is known as Scotland's Yes City, and that's because during the 2014 independence referendum, 57% of Dundonians voted in favour of an independent Scotland. In the last 5 minutes, the SNP leader and First Minister John Swinney has arrived in his shiny new campaign battle bus, and he joins me now. This is a whistle-stop tour of Scotland that you're on today. Dundee has been classed as an SNP stronghold, but a recent poll suggested that there could be a Labour resurgence here. Are you concerned that cities like this across Scotland could turn red?
It's pretty clear there's a hotly contested election on in Scotland, but south of the border the election is well and truly over, and there's the certainty of a Labour government being elected because the Tories are going to be defeated so badly south of the border. So in Scotland people have got a choice. They've got a choice between a Labour government that's going to prolong austerity within Scotland, carrying on where the Tories have left off, or they can elect SNP MPs who will be campaigning against spending cuts in favour of restoring our relationship with the European Union and always putting Scotland's interests first in the House of Commons. So what SNP MPs will work to do is to make sure that we have a future made in Scotland for Scotland, and that's why people should be voting SNP and will be voting SNP on Thursday.
You mentioned spending cuts there, but an independent Scotland wouldn't come without its costs either.
Well, independent Scotland would have access to all the full range of economic powers that any other independent country would have access to, which we don't currently have access to. But what we're facing in Scotland is the prospect of the election of a Labour government which has committed itself to the same fiscal outlook as the Conservatives and have accepted £18 billion worth of spending cuts, which will have a damaging effect on our public services in Scotland. So we've got an opportunity on Thursday to make clear that's not acceptable to Scotland, and by electing SNP MPs we can make that argument and take that case to the House of Commons to make sure we've got strong voices to protect Scotland in the aftermath of this election.
Critics would suggest that you're playing a blame game. You know, we point to the Tories having been in power for more than a decade, but the SNP have been in power for 17 years. Surely you have to take some responsibility for the situation we find ourselves in terms of the cost of living crisis, in terms of a crisis in the NHS, education.
Well, we've taken tough decisions to protect people from the cost of living. The Scottish Child Payment is giving families, low-income families, £26 a week per child right into household incomes to try to support those families who are facing real hardship as a consequence of the mistakes made by the Conservative government. And what those families don't need is a Labour government imposing more spending cuts that will affect our ability to invest in education or housing, because that's where the bulk of the public finances of Scotland come from. So in this election on Thursday, some real choices for people where we've seen austerity, Brexit, the cost of living, all imposed on Scotland by a United Kingdom government, and we need to have the powers in Scotland to enable us to have a future made in Scotland for Scotland that will allow us to take better decisions for the people of Scotland.
And you mentioned Brexit there, and you haven't ruled out some sort of collaboration with Labour when it comes to immigration, a Scottish visa, for example?
Well, if the Labour Party comes forward with proposals in government that will see us opening up some routes to migration that will help us with the economic and social damage that's been done by the lack of access to safe routes to migration, then we of course will work with them. But of course what we've got to realise is the big damage that's been done to us has been the imposition of Brexit, which was imposed on Scotland against our will, and it's now doing real damage to the economy in Scotland and in the rest of the United Kingdom. And this election debate has not really focused on that economic damage. It's almost like the Labour Party and the Conservatives just accepted that damage to our economy. Well, we don't accept that in Scotland, and SNP MPs will ensure that we take forward the arguments to restore our relationship with Europe and to have a better and safer approach to migration.
As you touched on, you are in key constituencies. How concerned you are about the debacle with regards to postal votes? We've seen some emergency centres have to be set up across Scotland because people simply haven't received their pack.
When this election was called, I expressed the concern that there were practical issues arising out of the fact that it was taking place during the Scottish school summer holidays. And of course lots of people said that I was saying things that weren't the case and all the rest of it. Well, actually, here are the practical implications. People are now away on holiday because the Scottish schools are off on their summer break and they haven't had their postal votes. That's disenfranchised people, and that sits fair and square at the door of Downing Street, who called this election without a single consideration of the situation here in Scotland and the fact that families would be away on holidays. Now, there's lots of people getting in touch with me about the fact that their postal votes have not arrived. We're putting them in touch with public authorities, as we should do, and it's important that every effort is made to try to support people so they can cast a vote in the election on Thursday.
How confident are you that we will see SNP win out in Dundee and at other seats that you've held out in the past?
Well, we're going into this election to win the election, to make sure that we secure a majority of Scottish parliamentary constituencies in this election. That's what we're focused on. We're working really hard around the country to do so, and I'm confident the SNP will do very well in this election.
With that in mind, John Swinney, thank you so much for your time there. John Swinney and the campaign battle bus will be continuing south as part of their whistle-stop tour across Scotland today.
Louise, thanks very much. Let me bring you breaking news coming from the Euros and UEFA, the governing body, because UEFA is saying that they are investigating a gesture made by the England midfielder Jude Bellingham after he scored that late equaliser against Slovakia yesterday. The goal on the screen that you will remember, but the Real Madrid star gestured towards the Slovakian bench after that goal brought England level. And UEFA releasing a statement today which reads, and I'll read it to you, a UEFA ethics and disciplinary inspector will conduct a disciplinary investigation regarding a potential violation of the basic rules of decent conduct by the English Football Association player Jude Bellingham, having allegedly occurred in the scope of this match. These are the pictures of obviously the England fans' reaction, but of course, Jude Bellingham did post on X about this matter after the game, and he posted about the gesture saying, quote, an inside joke gesture towards some close friends who were at the game, nothing but respect for how the Slovakia team played tonight. But you may have seen the gesture on social media. UEFA have decided to investigate that gesture. A UEFA ethics and disciplinary investigation will now be carried out. No timeline on that, but that the latest coming from the Euros and the England midfielder Jude Bellingham. Now let's return to the United States, where the justices at the Supreme Court will decide in the next few minutes whether Donald Trump has immunity from the most serious criminal charges against him, the federal indictment for trying to subvert the 2020 election and to stay in power. It'll be the first time the High Court has considered whether a president can be criminally prosecuted for actions he took whilst in office. Let's speak to the former US Attorney for Minnesota, Rachel Pullers. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us here on BBC News. Just how significant is this decision from the Supreme Court?
This will be a very significant decision from the Supreme Court, determining the outer scope of presidential authority and immunity. So on the one hand, the court needs to balance the need for presidents to be able to act swiftly, decisively, and powerfully. But on the other hand, they need to ensure that they do not hand presidents any kind of despotic power or ability to act without consequence if their actions cross a criminal line.
Did we get any sort of clues from the oral arguments a few months ago? Because I remember that exchange where those pushing and saying Donald Trump should not have blanket immunity posed the question that if you followed the logic of what the Trump lawyers were arguing, that he could potentially assassinate someone and there'd be no consequences.
Yes, there were very interesting questions at the oral argument, clearly reflecting the justices' concern with the extremes on both sides of the question. Again, protecting the president from any kind of political harassment, but at the same time not empowering him to take completely lawless and reckless actions. So I thought one of the most important questions came from Justice Amy Coney Barrett when she obtained essentially a concession from Trump lawyers that some of his actions on January 6th, at least some of his actions on January 6th, were in fact private actions, political actions, and not official actions, namely his attempts to propose an alternative slate of electors who would vote for Trump, not Biden.
Yes, that's absolutely critical, isn't it? That issue of whether he was acting in an official capacity or just an ordinary capacity. So we'll see what the judges decide on that. There is the thought, in a sense, there could be a middle ground decision. How problematic or otherwise is if there's not a clear, clean decision in the coming minutes?
Well, I think there will be a clear, clean decision because the test in this case really has to be a legal one. The factual question will be left to the particular trial judge as to how the legal test implicates Donald Trump personally, but the legal principle of what level immunity presidents have will be one, as Justice Gorsuch said, that'll be a test for the ages. And that principle has to be that the president is protected for official acts within the scope of his authority. And then the court needs to give a definition of what constitutes official acts under the presidency.
Remind our viewers watching around the world, in terms of the indictments, the charges, what indictments relate to exactly what we're talking about, which makes, of course, this decision really crucial.
Sure. So the president is facing 4 different cases in 4 different jurisdictions, one in New York, one in Georgia, and 2 at the federal level by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith. This particular case involves his claims of presidential immunity for acts arising out of the attack on the Capitol on January 16th and his own efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. This case, I think, is by far the most important of the 4. And polling shows that voters view this as significant in terms of potentially impacting their vote in the upcoming November election.
Just to keep viewers up to date, this is the last day the Supreme Court is sitting before they break for the summer, and I think they're looking at 3 or 4 different cases. I'm seeing that one of the other cases has just gone through, so I think we've had 2 of the 4, so we're not that far away from this crucial, significant decision. Just tell us why it's taken so long for the Supreme Court to actually get to this moment.
Well, the U.S. legal system does not move quickly. And I think actually more of the issue with delay can be laid at the feet of the Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, who took years to bring this case. And so it's really not the job of the Supreme Court. And in fact, it would be quite inappropriate for them to rush a decision in order to obtain a particular result to affect the outcome of this election happening in November. But the U.S. justice system simply does not move at lightning speed. And as I say, this decision is much bigger than Donald Trump. It's much bigger than the election of 2024.
Rachel, stay with us because I'm hoping that we are going to get this decision in the next few moments. But whilst we wait, let me bring in another voice, because let's speak to the Democratic strategist who worked on both the Obama and Hillary Clinton presidential campaigns, Michael Starr-Hopkins. Michael, welcome here to the programme. I was just asking there, in terms of the significance of what we're about to see, why don't you start with your assessment on that first of all?
Yeah, the American democracy is built around the notion that we have presidents, not kings, and that presidents, like every member of our society, can be held accountable for their actions. Should the court decide to grant immunity to Donald Trump, we no longer would have presidents, but we would, in fact, have more of an authoritarian monarchy. Not holding Donald Trump accountable for the raid on the Capitol, for the attempt to overthrow the government, is anti-democratic and is frankly an influence of the Republican and right-wing ideology that's taken over the majority in the court.
He, of course, argues that you can't act as a president if you don't have immunity.
Yeah, and the idea that a president can do anything and have immunity is exactly what the framers rejected. Obviously, a president should be able to, in the course and conduct of his office, do things like wartime acts and not have to make second and third guessing in the moment. But when you're talking about things like presidents being able to assassinate members of the opposition party using Seal 6, like the courts asked Donald Trump's attorneys, that's not what a democracy is about. And so Donald Trump keeps pushing the boundaries further and further as to what the U.S. democracy is going to look like.
We know the court has a 6-3 Conservative bias. Are you worried at all as we wait in these moments before the decision? Are you worried that actually the former president might just win or partially win on this?
You know, I'm worried that they're going to do a carve out, that they may make some exception or throw this back to the lower court. This isn't a novel concept. The Supreme Court's only supposed to take a case if it's a new and novel concept. You know, I started out my career as a public defender in Manhattan, and we learned early on what it meant for courts, the Supreme Court itself specifically, to take on such important cases. This was a case that they didn't have to take on, and what it did was really extend the clock for Donald Trump to be able to run this case out if he were to win the presidency. He knows that what he did was wrong. He knows that what he did was criminal, which is why he's making this argument, because he doesn't want to be held accountable, because he wants to use the court and its influence to run the clock out. That's just not what a democracy is about.
It was originally hoped that there might be a court case back in March before, of course, the Supreme Court decided to take this. They then have had this consideration time, critics would say delay. Is there any chance, whichever way it goes today, that the trial will happen before the November election?
I think it's going to be tough to have the trial at least in before the election. The judge has said that he's going to give, Judge Chalk in D.C. has said she's going to give 88 days of preparation to the Trump legal team to get ready. So we're really going to be pushing right up against that edge. But look, as long as there are days in the court to hold Trump accountable, then he should be held accountable. This idea that he should be treated differently, that there should be a second or third level of treatment for Trump rather than for the average citizen. If an average American did what Trump did, he would have gone to trial and he would have been convicted. And we know that because we watch people be held accountable who committed crimes on January 6th. Donald Trump is no different. He should be held accountable too. And his access to money and influence shouldn't stop that.
You mentioned in your earlier answer the lower courts, because there is the potential here, isn't there, if there's a partial decision, that there's partial immunity in some areas, that it gets thrown back down to the lower courts. And of course, that too means further delay in any sort of progressing of this case, this heading to trial.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump strategy across all of his cases has been to delay. It's file as many motions as you can, make as many objections as you can, and try as many appeals as you can. Because when you're guilty of something, you want to delay it out as long as possible. When you're innocent of something, you want to take it before the people and have your day of court. The idea that Donald Trump would rather extend this in his hopes that he could become president and dismiss this should tell not just the American public, but the international public who Donald Trump is. But frankly, I think most of the world already knows.
Well, look, we haven't had the ruling. I was hoping it was going to come as we were talking to you. We wait to see it emerge from the Supreme Court in Washington. But Michael Starr Hopkins, thanks very much for talking to us, and Rachel Pauloise before. And before we move on, I interrupt myself simply because I'm just keeping an eye on the very latest coming from the court. And note that is the third of the cases that I was saying that the Supreme Court was looking to. So it still hasn't dropped, but I don't think we're that far away. So perhaps Rachel and Michael will return to you in the next little while. But thanks for those thoughts, that analysis, as we await that ruling. Well, whilst we wait, let's catch up with the very latest weather details. Let's join Darren Bett.
Hello there. This isn't really the sort of weather we'd expect to see at this time of the year. Had a lot of cloud today. There'll be cloudy skies through much of the weekend, bringing with it the chance of some rain. Cooler breeze will be blowing and temperatures are going to be below average as well. Let's have a look at the rainfall accumulation. The darker blues into the greens, showing where we're going to see most of the rain falling over the week ahead. So Western Scotland in the firing line, other western areas seeing most of the rain, not much rain further east, and that's because our weather is going to be coming in from the Atlantic. And this area of cloud here, that's been bringing the rain today, most of it light and patchy. And ahead of that rain in the southeast, temperatures could reach 21 degrees. We're near a 17 Celsius in the central belt of Scotland, and most of that rain should have cleared Scotland by the end of the afternoon, and what's left of the rain will just sink down across England and Wales, keeping cloudy skies for many eastern parts of England overnight. That'll keep the temperatures a bit higher as well, but where we have the clearer skies following into Scotland and Northern Ireland in particular, temperatures could be into single figures. Tomorrow, the cloud across eastern England, particularly in the southeast in the morning, could produce a little light rain or drizzle. There'll be some sunshine elsewhere, but the cloud will build. We'll see a few more showers coming in and some perhaps wetter weather coming into western Scotland and Northern Ireland during Tuesday afternoon in that Atlantic breeze. So temperatures are only 16 degrees typically in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and 20 at best in southern parts of England and Wales. So those temperatures below average for the time of year. And we've got more weather fronts coming in from the northwest, pushing eastwards on Wednesday, giving us a messy sort of picture on Wednesday. A lot of cloud, some rain from time to time, nothing particularly heavy or prolonged. May get some sunshine following the rain in Northern Ireland, sunshine and showers into Scotland as the wind picks up a bit as well. So 16 to 18 degrees. Disappointing for this time of the year. That area of low pressure moves away. Quite a windy day, I think, on Thursday before some more weather fronts threaten some more rain into England and Wales on Friday. So as you can see, it's a very unsettled week ahead. Winds coming in from the west or northwest, keeping the temperatures a bit lower. Most of the rain in the west, not quite so wet further east.
Morning. Come and have a seat. Now, of course, I'm not going to go easy on you. There are some really big questions we've got to try and get answers to this morning. But I'll be fair, and we just want to hear what you've got to say. So, shall we get on with it?
We're rolling.
Here we go. Join me to hear from the biggest names inside and outside politics.
Sunday with Laura Koonsberg. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Today we're looking at the state of British politics.
Asking, is technology ruining football?
Are we too obsessed with our phones?
Helen from Hull wants to know, how hot's the planet going to get?
And we'll explain why prices keep going up and up.
Also, Rach, did you know space has its own smell?
Really? What of? The world is fast-moving and can be confusing.
So let's talk about it.
5 Live Breakfast with Rachel and Rick. Listen on BBC Sounds.
I'm telling you, there's going to be a revolution.
Have you considered resigning over this? Because you're clearly embarrassed.
Of course, I have been. I have thought about this.
I want to be totally honest with you, and I am being honest with you.
At least this should be a common ground for everyone. We should defend international law.
In the spirit of your title of Hard Talk, you're completely wrong.
Not offended, but I want to hear why.
You're completely wrong.
Hard Talk. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Welcome to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. Marine Le Pen's far-right party comes out on top in the first round of snap French elections. Satellite images show lightning in the centre of Hurricane Beryl as the Caribbean prepares for a potentially catastrophic storm. Extraordinary footage as a runaway military horse collides with a car in central London in a second bolting incident in just a matter of months. And this year's Wimbledon gets underway. Andy Murray says he will decide later today whether to play as he continues to recover from injury. Let's return to France because the National Rally Party has taken a commanding lead in the first round of the country's snap general election. President Emmanuel Macron is now calling for centrist and left-wing parties to unite rather than split the vote, as the far right hopes to win a parliamentary majority in the second and final round, and that is next weekend. Well, earlier I spoke to Renaud Girard, who's senior reporter at Le Figaro, who was talking about the future for Jordan Bardella, who is the potential next prime minister for that party.
His party, the National Rally, had such a lead that in the British system, he would be this morning the Prime Minister.
I'll come to that complicated second round in a moment or two, but the National Rally, they doubled their votes since 2022 and broadened their appeal in terms of the various target audiences. Give me your assessment as to why.
It's very simple, actually, because they had a campaign based on we want more order, more law and order. So it's more order in the streets. Remember that we had the riots last June in France. More order in the government schools, more order at our borders, because you have like tens of thousands of illegal immigrants arriving in France every month, and more order in the treasury. So this message, this simple message, went right with the electorate, and it's why they have such a lead.
Give me an idea of how you think it's going to go in the second round, because President Macron, in a sense, wants more tactical voting. But how is that going to play out? Because potentially you could end up with a large amount of far-right MPs, a largish amount of far-left MPs, with his centrist party squeezed in the middle. I mean, do you expect people to make way to try to stop the far-right, or not necessarily?
Obviously, it's a huge failure for President Macron. He's gambled, didn't work at all. That's one point. The second point, that the left, have used this argument, no pasarán, the so-called fascists will not get to power and so on. And it has been used like time and time again, but now it doesn't actually work in France. But I do not think that they will get an absolute majority in the National Assembly. They need 289 seats. I do not think that they will get them. And Jordan Bardella, the leader of the National Rally, has already said that if he does not have an absolute majority to do the policy that he wants to do, he would not accept a proposition by the President of the Republic to become Prime Minister.
At the latest from France, let me take you back to the Supreme Court, because we are getting the details of that really significant judgment about presidential immunity. And it is slightly complicated, but in a sense, the court is deciding partial immunity and is sending the case back to the lower courts. Let me read you a couple of sentences, because the US Supreme Court finds that former presidents are entitled to absolute immunity for prosecutions for actions within their constitutional authority. But the court goes on to find that the former presidents are not entitled to immunity from prosecutions for actions taken in a private capacity. So you see both elements of that decision. So that is why it is a partial immunity judgment. We were talking in the last few minutes, as we were expecting this, to Rachel Polwaz and also to Michael Starr-Hopkins. So let's return to both of them and get their snapshot reaction to what we've just heard. Rachel, to you first of all.
To be clear, but the Supreme Court's job is to issue legal principle, not determine facts. And so this is a decision based on a legal principle. The court says the president has absolute immunity for official acts. The question for Donald Trump is going to be, what acts did he take that were purely unofficial and personal? And so some of the most critical questions for him in this case are yet to be determined by the lower courts.
Michael, your thoughts?
This is an extension for Donald Trump. Now the lower court is going to have to be a trier of fact, and they're going to have to decide what was an official act and what was an unofficial act. I think that the politicization of this decision is going to be really the bad thing for this court. The fact that this was a 6-3 decision and not a 9-0 decision, that would have been something that really would have been good for the strength of the judiciary and people's faith in the court system. Now, much of America is just going to believe this was decided among party lines, like, in fact, it probably was.
Well, it's interesting you make that point because I hadn't read how the court and the justices split, but I'd asked you before in the run-up to it, were you worried about the fact that it's a 6-3 split of Conservative judges? And you said you had concerns, and presumably the ruling, if it is that split, have underlined those concerns that you were worried about.
Yeah, I mean, so I've seen the split. It came down directly by party lines. The justices who were appointed by Republicans, including Donald Trump, ruled in his favor, and the justices who were appointed by Democratic justices, or Democratic presidents rather, ruled in favor of what I would say is democracy. This is only going to go further to erode trust in our system, and I think it actually is going to allow Donald Trump to even further push the boundaries of what's constitutional and what's not.
Rachel, when we were talking before, I think Michael was making the point, or maybe it was you, that the court had already ruled that 88 days were required before this would come to trial. Now we're heading back to the lower courts. It must rule out any sort of potential for this case to come to trial before November and the election.
I just don't know how quickly the lower courts can move. But again, that was a timeline set by the lower courts, not by the Supreme Court. And given how complicated this decision is, there are a number of factual issues that will have to be sorted out by the district court in this situation. That will not be a speedy process.
And is that decision, when it comes in the lower courts, is that challengeable as well? Could that potentially go back to the Supreme Court, or it doesn't work that way?
That decision on the merits, on the facts, can be appealed. The defendant has a right to appeal any criminal case up to federal appellate courts. The Supreme Court's review in this country is discretionary, meaning the Supreme Court is not required to take any case. And in fact, they only end up taking about 5 to 6% of the cases that they are asked to hear.
Michael, let me bring you back in, because America, the politicians, the parties, the individuals have been waiting a long time for this judgment. It has come on the last day of those Supreme Court justices sitting. Where do you think this leaves the US justice system now?
I think it leaves the justice system weaker than it was earlier today. The idea that we're going to treat a president who has commander-in-chief powers as someone who's immune, absolutely immune from prosecution, under this logic, theoretically, we could see Donald Trump assassinate Joe Biden using SEAL Team 6, and because he's commander-in-chief, that falls under his discretionary behavior, and it would be allowed. This leads more questions than it does answers. And when you're given someone like Donald Trump, who is corrupt, who has little to no moral compass, who pushes the boundaries at every opportunity, it leaves not just Americans, but I think the international community concerned about what's next. And you can only really look to Republicans to blame. They're the ones who keep allowing Donald Trump to exhibit the behavior and really destroy the foundations that have made this country what it is.
And of course, there is every likelihood, is there not, Michael, that if Donald Trump was to win in November and this case hasn't reached the trial stage, it may never reach the trial stage.
If Donald Trump becomes president, this trial won't ever see the trial phase. Norms as we know it will be broken down. I know it's hyperbole, but when we say that if Donald Trump becomes president, this very well may be the last election as we know it, that's true. He really wants to unshackle this right-wing party that we've seen take over a lot of our country.
Just as we've been waiting for this over the months, how much attention is it actually getting among ordinary American voters? I know legal analysts are all over this, journalists are all over this, but how much is this playing among ordinary voters?
So I think the actual trial phase, a lot of the court shenanigans that have gone on, the average American hasn't been following that. But what they do know is that there's a fear of Trump becoming a dictator. And when they hear about the court's ruling in this case, it's only going to further that fear. So where they may not be tuned into the day-to-day court actions that are going on, they understand the narrative. And this court empowering Donald Trump to continue his authoritarian behavior is something that is not just going to put more fear in the hearts of Democrats, but really should raise the awareness of Americans all across the country.
How complicated is it going to be in the lower courts to try to sift through what falls under the category of presidential and official acts and private acts, given this was all around the run-up to January the 6th and afterwards?
I think it's going to be a mess because the court's going to have one fact ruling, and then it's going to be appealed, and then it'll probably be brought back. And this is going to go back and forth for a while. And that was the plan all along for Republicans. It was never to get justice. It was just to delay justice. And it's always ironic because Republicans are often talking about how they're the party of stopping crime. They're the party of justice. Well, they now have an opportunity to not just defend our democracy, but uphold justice, to live their ideals. And what do? They don't just undermine it, but they really fracture and weaken our democracy and our justice system.
And when you take a step back over the last few days, you had the debate on Thursday night, which was catastrophic for Joe Biden. You've now got this. Where do you think you are in terms of the outlook politically there in the US?
Every American, whether they're a Democrat or Republican, needs to take a minute today and decide how much they love living in a democracy. Because whether you're a fan of Joe Biden or whether you're not a fan of Joe Biden, this election is bigger than one person. This is bigger than Donald Trump, and this is bigger than Joe Biden. It's about the parties. And Democrats and Republicans offer two very different viewpoints. Democrats want reproductive health, reproductive freedom. They want an economy that works for everyone. And Republicans want to make the rich richer, the poor poorer, and create a second tier for people who don't have access, like the average person.
Well, Michael, we are going to leave it there, but thanks very much. And just as I thank Michael, I can tell you that Donald Trump has reacted pretty swiftly. He has called that Supreme Court ruling, the immunity opinion, a, quote, big win for democracy. So a pretty swift response from Donald Trump describing what has happened at the Supreme Court as a big win for democracy. Let's bring in John McHenry, a Republican pollster who is based in Northern Virginia. And John, welcome here to the programme. So what do you make of what we have just heard from the Supreme Court?
Well, I think that you have to see today as a win for the former president. The irony is if he had won this case completely, if the justices had ruled that every president has complete immunity from charges, that would have hurt him politically. It would have driven Democrats in this country to the polls like nothing else other than perhaps the Dobbs decision, which returned abortion back to the states. Because every Democrat and a lot of independents would have said, we've got to do everything we can to stop Donald Trump. If he has complete immunity, who knows what he'll do? And they would have swamped the polls and probably helped Joe Biden, ironically enough, in November. This case, I think, sort of puts in place the status quo. I think people sort of knew that he was liable for his actions in this case on January 6th. And were making their voting decision based on the economy, based on the fitness of the candidates for office. With this sort of in the background, and I think this ultimately doesn't change things.
But you think it helps him most that actually it's a partial immunity decision, right, as opposed to saying either way, just absolutely a clean decision?
Right. If every president had been declared liable for every decision that they made in an official capacity or not, Republicans would have streamed to the polls saying that this was another example of the establishment trying to take down Donald Trump. So he actually probably came out best with this sort of middle ground ruling.
Isn't it worrying when the justices, Chief Justice Roberts, saying there are some acts that Donald Trump is absolutely immune from, the official acts he took as president? Because we heard in the oral argument, and people have constantly referred to it, because one of the questions that was put to those justices, well, if a sitting president ordered the assassination of someone, is he immune from that? That's an official act, and that's the logic of the argument. Isn't that where this decision also takes us to?
Potentially, and part of this is, I'm sure it's a 100-page decision that we're all going to have to sit down and read a little bit later. There may, in fact, be some sort of test to decide whether it's an official act. It may be left up to judges in the future or up to Congress. I think most Americans would say certainly that should be an illegal act if it's not undertaken under the auspices of Congress. So we'll have to see how that works out. I don't think we're going to see Donald Trump order any assassinations in the first couple of months if he wins re-election.
Sure, but I suppose it tells us where we are if a simple question like that is answered in the way that you just answered
that
it.
Question, that's right.
How worrying is it?
The question shows us where we are.
Yeah, it really does. How worrying is it? Our previous commentator, Michael Starr-Hopkins, was saying, in his view, he thought it was really damaging that this decision was the 6-3 Conservative Liberal split that we know exists in the Supreme Court. It would have been much better for all of America if it had been a unanimous 9-0. Do you share that view?
It certainly would have been better for the country even if it had been 7-2 or 8-1 to see at least one of the liberal judges be able to agree with the ruling on the grounds, or even to see a conservative say, no, wait, we've gone too far, and see it a little bit different than what the ruling was. So yes, I think most of us would have liked to see a 7-2, 8-1, 9-0 decision, and it will fire up some Democrats to say this is just the Supreme Court that Donald Trump has cobbled together making this decision.
Given everything we saw around the efforts to not abide by the 2020 result, and of course January the 6th, it looks entirely possible now that we will never see a trial. Is that a good thing in your view, a trial of a former president, given there have been plenty of trials with plenty of people that took part on January the 6th?
Ultimately, I think that American voters would want to see the president held responsible for his actions in a court of law, whether they decide for him or against him. To some extent, I think it would probably be better for his legacy if he were able to stand trial and be proven innocent, whether that's actually going to happen or not, to have his opportunity to present his defense. It shows a certain weakness if you say that you've got to step in and squash a prosecution.
Would you say, as our previous contributor assessed, that it is most unlikely now, given there's going to be to and fro to the lower courts, that this is ever going to see a trial?
I think it's a little bit more up in the air than that. Jack Smith sort of has his marching orders now. He's certainly capable of putting what he needs to in front of the judge immediately. This judge seems to want to rule on this fairly quickly. So while it seems unlikely, I don't think it's impossible at all that this case at least starts before we get to the November election.
You think that's still possible to you?
I do. It depends on whether there's a strict test for the judge to follow in this case based on what the actual ruling is. And again, we haven't all read it yet. But I do think that if Jack Smith needs this to happen and Judge Chutkan wants this to happen, that we should be able to see at least the start of a trial in October.
And just a final thought, because we are heading to November and the election itself. We know the issues that dominate in terms of ordinary Americans. Give me your view of how big this plays, if at all.
I think it's a consideration for probably 1 or 2% of Americans, which doesn't sound like a lot. I think most Republicans are, going to vote for Donald Trump regardless. I think most Democrats are going to, if not vote for Joe Biden, certainly vote against Donald Trump, which means they'll ultimately probably vote for Joe Biden. That very small minority that hasn't made up their minds, this may weigh on them still as we see this sort of back and forth and calls for a trial and calls against a trial. And that 1 or 2% might actually be decisive in a country that's so evenly split. I'm sure both candidates are going to get to 48%, and that last remaining 4% is going to be decisive.
John, we have to leave it there, but thanks for that snapshot analysis after we got that decision, that split partial immunity decision from the Supreme Court. As I say, Donald Trump reacting very quickly, describing it as a big win for democracy. We will have plenty more reaction to that breaking news from the US. But before we get to the top of the hour, it's worth just returning very quickly to our general election. Nick Eardley is out there on the campaign trail. So let's join him. And Nick, bring us right up to date with where you are, who you're with and what you've been hearing.
Hi, Matthew. Yeah, we're in Stratford-on-Avon, believe it or not, with Rishi Sunak. And I say that because this is a part of England that should be pretty safe territory for the Conservatives, actually. A notional majority of more than 19,000. Not necessarily the kind of place you would expect the Conservative leader to be campaigning with, 2 days to go until the campaign is over. I think it gives you a sense of how the Conservative campaign is going. This, as I say, is the kind of place that they would normally expect to win comfortably, but I think they're a bit nervous about the vote here. Not necessarily that they'll lose, but it'll be a lot closer than it has been in the past. And having spent the morning with the Prime Minister, do you know what's really striking? It's that he isn't necessarily talking about all the reasons to vote Conservative. He does talk about them, but his main message, the thing he's battering home to voters over the next few days, is a warning about the potential size of a Labour majority on Friday morning. He is saying if you want to stop a super majority, as he calls it, although that's not actually a thing within the UK system, if you want to stop that super majority, you should vote Conservative.
Brief, quick final thought, Nick, because it is always an issue, isn't it, when, in a sense, you are making warnings. People will describe that as negative as opposed to putting forward a positive vision.
Well, yeah, look, I mean, Rishi Sunak can see the polls the same as anyone else. He can see the predictions that Labour are 20 points ahead in most of the polls quite consistently for some time now. I think when you chat to Conservative candidates, people who are hoping to be elected on Thursday, the message you get is that they want to target two types of voters over the next few days. Firstly, people who have voted Conservative in the past, but maybe won't this time, either because they're going to abstain or because they're going to vote for Nigel Farage's Reform Party. There are a lot of Conservatives who want to target them, and undecided voters. All the parties, all the candidates I've spoken to say there are a lot of voters still to make their minds up, and that is going to be a big focus over the next 48 hours or so.
Nick Eardley, thanks for the latest on the campaign trail. We'll be back out there in a moment or two, but why don't we pause, catch up with weather details, and that's with Darren Bett.
Hello there. This isn't really the sort of weather we'd expect to see at this time of the year. Had a lot of cloud today. There'll be cloudy skies through much of the weekend, bringing with it the chance of some rain. Cooler breeze will be blowing and temperatures are going to be below average as well. Let's have a look at the rainfall accumulation. The darker blues into the greens, showing where we're going to see most of the rain falling over the week ahead. So Western Scotland in the firing line, other western areas seeing most of the rain, not much rain further east, and that's because our weather is going to be coming in from the Atlantic. And this area of cloud here, that's been bringing the rain today, most of it light and patchy. And ahead of that rain, in the southeast, temperatures could reach 21 degrees. We're near a 17 Celsius in the central belt of Scotland, and most of that rain should have cleared Scotland by the end of the afternoon. And what's left of the rain will just sink down across England and Wales, keeping cloudy skies for many eastern parts of England overnight. That'll keep the temperatures a bit higher as well. But where we have the clearer skies following into Scotland and Northern Ireland in particular, temperatures could be into single figures. Tomorrow, the cloud across eastern England, particularly in the southeast in the morning, could produce a little light rain or drizzle. There'll be some sunshine elsewhere, but the cloud will build. We'll see a few more showers coming in and some perhaps wetter weather coming into Western Scotland and Northern Ireland during Tuesday afternoon in that Atlantic breeze. So temperatures are only 16 degrees typically in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and 20 at best in southern parts of England and Wales. So those temperatures below average for the time of year. And we've got more weather fronts coming in from the northwest, pushing eastwards on Wednesday, giving us a messy sort of picture on Wednesday. A lot of cloud, some rain from time to time, nothing particularly heavy or prolonged. May get some sunshine following the rain in Northern Ireland, sunshine and showers into Scotland as the wind picks up a bit as well. So 16 to 18 degrees. Disappointing for this time of the year. That area of low pressure moves away. Quite a windy day, I think, on Thursday before some more weather fronts threaten some more rain into England and Wales on Friday. So as you can see, it's a very unsettled week ahead. Winds coming in from the west or northwest, keeping the temperatures a bit lower. Most of the rain in the west, not quite so wet further east.